The unexpected encounter. Darren Cole was no stranger to luxury. In his prime, he had played on courts across the world, filling stadiums with fans who cheered his name. He had dined in the finest restaurants, stayed in penthouse suites, and driven cars most could only dream of. But those days were behind him. Now, retired from the game, he preferred a quieter life, free from the constant attention. That's why he had chosen the Sapphire Lux Hotel. Nestled in the heart of the city, it was known for its privacy, exclusivity, and discretion. The kind of place where even the wealthiest could blend in without drawing attention. Darren had stayed there multiple times, always receiving top-tier treatment. Tonight, however, something felt off the moment he stepped through the glass doors. The lobby was as pristine as ever, polished marble floors, chandeliers that dripped with crystals, and a fireplace that crackled softly. The air was scented with vanilla and sandalwood, creating an atmosphere of elegance. Darren adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder and approached the front desk. The young concierge, a fresh-faced woman in her early 20s, glanced up with a polite smile. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Sapphire Lux." Before she could finish, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Excuse me." A woman in a navy blue business suit, blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, strode forward. The gold name tag on her chest read Margaret, General Manager. Her lips pursed as she looked him over, as if evaluating whether he belonged. "May I ask what you're doing here?" Darren blinked, surprised by the question. "I have a reservation under Darren Cole." Margaret tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure about that?" Darren gave a small chuckle. "Pretty sure. Been here before, actually." Margaret's expression didn't change. If anything, her posture grew stiffer. "I don't recall seeing you." Darren's smile faded. He recognized that tone. He had heard it before, on the streets growing up, in meetings where executives underestimated him, in country clubs where he was the only black man in the room. "Maybe I stayed when you were off duty," Darren said, keeping his voice calm. Margaret folded her arms. "I don't think so. You see, we have a very exclusive clientele. Our guests typically meet certain standards." Darren stared at her. Margaret continued, unbothered by the weight of his silence. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Perhaps you meant to book a different hotel." The young concierge, still standing behind the desk, shifted uncomfortably. She recognized Darren now. How could she not? He was a legend. But she hesitated, trapped between her superior and the obvious truth. Darren exhaled slowly. "I know exactly where I booked. Would you like to check the reservation?" Margaret let out a fake laugh. "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary." Then, in a move that made the entire lobby freeze, Margaret spat at his feet. The sound was faint, barely a whisper against the marble floor, but it carried the weight of every unspoken insult, every act of discrimination Darren had endured in his lifetime. A horrified gasp rippled through the room. Guests, employees, and even a security guard standing near the entrance turned their heads. Darren could have reacted in so many ways. He could have shouted, demanded an apology, or even called the police. He could have let anger take over, let decades of frustration explode in this very moment. But instead, he nodded. He nodded, as if confirming something he had already known deep down. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door. As he stepped into the cool night air, he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Hey, Marcus," he said, his voice steady. "I need a favor." Margaret had made a mistake, one she was about to regret. The tables began to turn. The city lights shimmered against the dark sky as Darren Cole walked away from the Sapphire Lux Hotel. The cool air brushed against his skin, but the fire inside him burned hotter than ever. He wasn't a man who let emotions dictate his actions. He had learned long ago that calculated moves always outweighed impulsive reactions. As he stood near the curb, waiting for his car, he could still feel the weight of the moment lingering in his chest. The humiliation, the disbelief. Margaret, The so-called general manager of the Sapphire Lux had spat at his feet, dismissing him like he was beneath her. A multimillionaire, a legend in his sport, a man who had built himself from the ground up, overcoming obstacles that most would crumble beneath. And still, to her, he was nothing but a black man who didn't belong. Darren clenched his jaw and let out a slow breath. That was fine. Because what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that Darren wasn't just any guest. He was part owner of the Sapphire Lux hotel chain. The luxury hospitality industry had been one of his quieter investments, a way to expand his wealth outside of endorsements and sports-related ventures. He had bought into the Sapphire Lux brand years ago, drawn to its reputation for exclusivity and high-class service. He had helped build this empire. And now, one of his own employees had tried to throw him out. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce Phantom rolled to a stop in front of him. The driver, an older gentleman named Jacob, stepped out and opened the door. "Everything all right, sir?" Darren gave him a tight smile and nodded, sliding into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the hotel, he dialed the number of one of his business partners, Marcus Langston, a real estate mogul who had co-invested in several properties with him. Marcus picked up on the second ring. "D, what's up, man?" Darren exhaled through his nose. "We have a problem at Sapphire Lux. You free to meet?" Marcus picked up on the edge in Darren's voice immediately. "Say no more. Meet me at my office in 20. Darren hung up and leaned back against the leather seat, fingers drumming against his knee. Margaret had no idea who she had messed with, and soon she was going to learn in the hardest way possible. A lesson in humility. The office of Langston and Cole Investments was a high-rise sanctuary, overlooking the skyline with floor-to-ceiling windows. The walls were adorned with accolades, photographs of groundbreaking real estate developments, and pieces of art that reflected both men's success. Marcus was already waiting when Darren arrived, dressed in a tailored suit, sipping from a glass of whiskey. "All right," Marcus said, setting his glass down. "What happened?" Darren took a seat, recounting the events of the evening in detail. By the time he finished, Marcus had set his drink aside, his face dark with anger. "She spit at you," Marcus repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. Darren nodded. "And she called you a liar. Made it seem like you didn't belong. Like you were some random guy off the street." Another nod. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Bruh, she's done." Darren folded his hands. "I don't want to just fire her. That's too easy." Marcus leaned back, rubbing his chin. "I like where this is going. What's the plan?" A slow smile curved Darren's lips. "I'm going to make her watch everything she took for granted get ripped away." Marcus grinned. "Now we're talking. You thinking about a takeover?" Darren shook his head. "No need for a takeover. We already own it. What I want is impact. I want her to feel what it's like to be powerless, to have everything flipped on her in an instant." Marcus chuckled. "That's cold, man. I love it." Darren leaned forward. "We're holding an emergency staff meeting tomorrow morning. I want every single employee there. Front desk, housekeepers, kitchen staff, security, all of them." Marcus nodded. "I'll set it up. And Margaret?" Darren's smile widened. "She's about to have the worst day of her life. The reckoning begins." Margaret walked into the Sapphire Lux Hotel the next morning like she owned the place. She had slept soundly the night before, completely oblivious to what was coming. The lobby was already buzzing with nervous energy. Employees were gathered, whispering in small groups, their faces tense with confusion. Margaret frowned. "What's going on?" The young concierge from the night before, a girl named Anna, looked up hesitantly. "There's a mandatory staff meeting in 10 minutes. The new owner wants to address everyone." Margaret's brows shot up. "New owner? What are you talking about?" Anna bit her lip. "Mr. Langston and his business partner finalized something overnight. We just got the email." Margaret scoffed. "That's impossible. I would have known. She stormed toward the conference room, pushing the doors open just in time to see Darren Cole standing at the front of the room. Margaret's blood ran cold. His eyes locked onto hers immediately. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "Good morning, everyone," Darren said, his voice calm yet commanding. "I appreciate you all taking the time to be here on such short notice. As of this morning, there have been some significant changes to the ownership of this hotel. And with that, there will also be some much-needed policy adjustments." Margaret felt her stomach drop. She had severely miscalculated. Darren clasped his hands together. "Before we continue, I'd like to have a conversation with the hotel's general manager. In private." The entire room went silent. All eyes turned to Margaret. Her hands clenched at her sides. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, solidifying her position at the Sapphire Lux. And now, in a matter of hours, she could feel everything crumbling beneath her. She swallowed hard and took a step forward, her voice much weaker than the night before. "Of course, Mr. Cole." Darren smiled again, but this time, there was something dangerous in his eyes. "This should be interesting," he murmured. And with that, he led her out of the conference room, the weight of justice finally settling onto her shoulders. Margaret was about to learn what it felt like to be small, to be powerless. And this was only the beginning. The fall from grace. The walk to the executive office was suffocating. Margaret could feel every pair of eyes in the conference room drilling into her back as she followed Darren Cole out into the hallway. Her heels clacked against the marble floor, each step more uncertain than the last. Just yesterday, she had strutted through these halls like she owned the place. Now she wasn't sure if she'd even have a job by the end of the day. Darren led her to the executive boardroom, a luxurious space filled with polished mahogany furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a massive Sapphire Lux logo displayed prominently on the wall. He gestured toward a seat at the long table. "Sit." Margaret hesitated, her pride warring with the growing panic in her chest. But one look at Darren's face, calm, unreadable, in total control, made her stomach churn. This was a man who wasn't just here to talk. She sat down stiffly, folding her hands in her lap as Darren leaned against the table, arms crossed. For a long moment, he simply studied her, the silence stretched so thick it was suffocating. Margaret cleared her throat. I wasn't aware you were one of the new investors." Darren arched an eyebrow. "Is that what you think this is about? A misunderstanding?" Margaret forced out a small, rehearsed chuckle. "Look, last night, there was obviously some confusion. I was just doing my job, ensuring that our clientele meets the hotel's standards." Darren's expression didn't change. "And what exactly are those standards, Margaret?" She swallowed. "We cater to a particular demographic." "A particular demographic," Darren repeated, his voice dangerously smooth. Margaret forced a smile, though her hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't mean anything offensive, Mr. Cole. We just have to ensure a certain image is upheld." Darren exhaled slowly. "So let me get this straight. I, a paying guest at my own hotel, didn't meet your demographic standards." Margaret's throat went dry. Darren leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "Tell me, Margaret, would you have treated me differently if I were white?" She flinched. I treat all guests fairly." "Do you?" Darren cut her off, his tone sharp. "Because last night, you spit at my feet. You called me a liar. You tried to have security remove me based on nothing but your own prejudices." Margaret's face burned. "Let me make one thing clear," Darren said, his voice steady. "I didn't bring you in here to hear excuses. I brought you in here because there are consequences for people like you." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Mr. Cole, please, I have worked at this hotel for years. I've built my career here. Built it on exclusion. On bias." Darren shook his head. "And now, you're going to watch everything you built fall apart." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "You can't just fire me." Darren smiled. Oh, I could. But that's too easy. She swallowed hard. What does that mean? Darren tapped his fingers on the table. It means you're going to feel exactly what it's like to be powerless. Margaret's breath hitched. A knock at the door interrupted her. Marcus Langston stepped in, his phone in hand. It's done, he said, glancing at Darren. Darren nodded. Good. Margaret's stomach twisted. What's done? Darren turned back to her, his expression unreadable. You've been relieved of your position as general manager, effective immediately. Margaret's mouth fell open. You'll still be employed, Darren continued smoothly, but in a new role. One that will give you the chance to reevaluate how you treat people. Margaret's hands started shaking. I don't understand. Darren leaned forward, smiling coldly. You've been reassigned to the housekeeping staff. Her body went rigid. Marcus chuckled. That crisp white blazer of yours. Yeah, you can trade that in for a cleaning uniform. Margaret's mind went blank. Housekeeping. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, rubbing elbows with the wealthiest clientele, barking orders at the lower staff. And now she was being demoted to one of them. Darren tilted his head. Still think your demographic standards are fair, Margaret. Margaret shot to her feet. You can't do this. I have contracts. I'll sue. Darren didn't even blink. You signed a contract that allows for immediate reassignment based on internal reviews of conduct, which, by the way, we have on video. Margaret paled. You made a scene last night, Marcus added, and you did it in front of multiple witnesses, security footage, guest complaints, even hotel staff accounts. All of it paints a very ugly picture. Darren's eyes locked onto hers. And if you try to fight this, we'll make sure every hotel, resort, and luxury brand in the city sees those tapes. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. If she lost her reputation in this industry, she'd never get another job in high-end hospitality again. You're lucky we're giving you a chance to stay at all, Darren said, his voice calm but firm. If you do your job right, you'll still have a paycheck, but you're going to learn what it's like to be the person you've looked down on for years. Marcus smirked. Think of it as a lesson in humility. Margaret felt her world shattering around her. For the first time in years, she was completely powerless. She had always been the one with control, the one deciding who was worthy of staying, who belonged, who fit the image. And now she was the one who didn't belong. Her lips trembled. This isn't fair. Darren tilted his head. Unfair. Like how you treated me last night. She had no response. Report to the housekeeping manager at 7 a.m. sharp, Darren said. And if you're even a minute late, you're out. Margaret swallowed back the lump in her throat. She knew she had no choice. Darren straightened and gave her one last look. Oh, and Margaret. She hesitated. Yes. His smile was razor sharp. Make sure my suite is spotless. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She had gone from commanding the hotel's finest suites to scrubbing them. And for the first time in her life, she was getting exactly what she deserved. The weight of consequence. Margaret's alarm blared at 5:30 a.m., slicing through the uneasy sleep she had barely managed. She slapped at the clock with shaking hands, her stomach in knots. Housekeeping. The word sat like a lead weight in her chest. She had spent years clawing her way to the top. Endless hours of work, navigating the cutthroat world of luxury hospitality, mastering the art of making the right connections. And now, reduced to a maid. Her fingers curled into the expensive silk sheets she had once taken for granted. The thought of peeling them back, stepping onto the cold floor, and walking into that hotel, not as a manager, but as a uniformed worker, made her physically ill. A knock at her apartment door startled her. She frowned, wrapping herself in a robe before cautiously opening it. A delivery man stood there, holding a small package. Margaret Allen. She nodded stiffly. Courtesy of Sapphire Luxe. He handed her the package and walked away. Margaret shut the door and hesitantly unwrapped it. Inside was a neatly folded uniform, a crisp white housekeeping shirt, navy slacks, and an apron. There was a note. "Dress accordingly. Don't be late." She crumpled it in her fist, her throat burning. This wasn't just a demotion. This was humiliation. Darren Cole wanted her to suffer, and she knew there was nothing she could do to stop it. The fall from elegance. Margaret arrived at the hotel just before 7 a.m., the familiar grand lobby feeling alien to her. The concierge, whom she used to command with a simple nod, barely glanced her way. For the first time, no one scrambled to greet her. No one whispered her name in admiration. She was invisible. Her feet felt like lead as she stepped into the staff-only elevator, the one she had never used before. It smelled of industrial cleaners and sweat, a far cry from the perfumed air of the guest suites. The doors opened, and the bustling employee break room greeted her. She had never set foot in this part of the hotel. She had never cared to know the faces of the workers who made the luxury experience possible. Now she was one of them. A heavy-set woman in a housekeeping uniform glanced up from a clipboard. "You must be the new girl." Her voice was clipped, unimpressed. Margaret bristled. "I." The woman held up a hand. "I don't care what your story is. Here, you work or you leave." Margaret bit back a retort, swallowing her pride. "Understood." The woman thrust a cleaning cart toward her. "You're on sweet duty today. Follow Maria. She'll show you the ropes." A younger woman, maybe in her early 20s, stepped forward. She had a kind face but regarded Margaret with thinly veiled amusement. Margaret squared her shoulders, refusing to let these people see her weakness. Maria led her down the hall to the first suite, knocking politely before swiping the master key. "Guests check out at 11, but we start early when rooms are vacant," she explained. "Grab fresh sheets, start with the bathroom, then dust and vacuum. No shortcuts." Margaret clenched her jaw. She had once ordered rooms to be spotless. Now she had to be the one scrubbing them. Maria gave her a small smirk. "You ever cleaned a toilet before?" Margaret ignored her and stepped inside the suite. Her stomach dropped. Darren Cole's penthouse. The very same room she had tried to throw him out of. A note sat on the bed. "Make it spotless, Margaret. D.C." Margaret's face burned. She wanted to scream, to rip the sheets apart, to throw the cleaning supplies at the wall. But she knew that's what he wanted. So instead, she grabbed the fresh linens and got to work. The silence in the massive suite was deafening as she stripped the bed, rolling up the sheets and tossing them into the cart. The very act of doing it made her chest ache with resentment. She moved to the bathroom, glaring at the pristine marble. This was beneath her. She was supposed to be giving orders, not on her knees scrubbing grout. Margaret picked up a brush, hesitating. Her own reflection in the mirror stared back at her, tired and humiliated. "Maybe I deserve this." The thought came unbidden, and she shook it off violently. She did not deserve this. This was Darren's revenge. That was all. Her hands trembled as she started to scrub. Minutes stretched into an hour. The sweat on her brow mixed with frustration as she worked, her muscles aching from exertion she wasn't used to. By the time she was done, her uniform was damp, her hands raw, her pride shredded. And yet, the room was spotless. Margaret stepped back, breathing heavily. The sound of slow applause made her stiffen. She turned. Darren Cole leaned against the doorway, watching her with an infuriatingly calm expression. He strolled inside, running a finger along the countertop. Not bad." Margaret clenched her jaw. Darren glanced at her. "I hope you're starting to understand something, Margaret." She glared at him. His eyes darkened. "You look down on people like me. Like them." He gestured vaguely toward the staff hallway. "You assumed wealth equaled worth, and now you get to see what it's like to serve." Margaret's hands curled into fists. "You think this is a punishment?" she snapped. Darren smirked. Oh, it's not just a punishment. It's a lesson. Her stomach twisted. You can quit if you want, Darren said casually. Walk away. But if you stay, his eyes gleamed. You learn. Margaret's breath hitched, because for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if she could face the truth. A lesson in humility. Margaret stood frozen as Darren's words echoed in her head. You can quit, but if you stay, you learn. She wanted to lash out, to tell him he was wrong, that this was beneath her. But deep down, a bitter truth gnawed at her pride. She had nowhere else to go. The weight of her own arrogance had dragged her down, and the universe had no intention of lifting her back up. Darren gave her one last smirk before turning on his heel, leaving her alone in the sparkling clean penthouse. Margaret swallowed hard. She had done this to herself. The cost of arrogance. The next morning, Margaret was up at the crack of dawn again. The soreness in her limbs from scrubbing Darren's penthouse hadn't faded, and her back ached in ways it never had before. When she arrived at the staff locker room, the usual hum of conversation stopped. Eyes flicked toward her, some amused, some indifferent, others openly hostile. She had spent years treating these people as invisible. Now she was forced to stand among them as an equal. Maria, the young housekeeper from the day before, walked over, arms crossed. Still here? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Margaret forced her chin up. Yes. Maria studied her before giving a small shrug. Suit yourself. The head housekeeper, a no-nonsense woman named Linda, appeared with the assignments for the day. She handed Margaret a clipboard. You're on standard suites today, Linda said. 20 rooms. And I expect them perfect. Margaret's stomach dropped. 20 rooms. She had barely handled one the day before. But she nodded stiffly. Understood. Linda gave her a sharp look, as if waiting for her to complain. When Margaret didn't, she simply turned away. Maria smirked. Good luck, princess. A battle of pride. Margaret started with the first room, rolling her cleaning cart in. The bed was unmade, towels were piled on the floor, and an empty champagne bottle sat on the nightstand. Her old self would have sneered at the mess, shaking her head at sloppy guests. Now, she was the one picking it all up. Her body protested as she stripped the bed, her fingers fumbling with the heavy duvet. Sweat formed on her forehead as she wiped down the mirrors, vacuumed, scrubbed, and replaced linens. By the time she was done, 40 minutes had passed, and she had 19 more rooms to go. She stepped out into the hall, exhausted, only to hear laughter from a few other housekeepers down the corridor. First one took her almost an hour, one of them whispered. Margaret gritted her teeth. She refused to fail. Room after room, she worked, her body growing heavier with each passing hour. Her designer nails, once pristine, began to chip from the constant scrubbing. Her back throbbed, her feet ached, and by the time she reached the 10th room, she was ready to collapse. But quitting would mean letting Darren win. So she pushed forward. A humbling encounter. By late afternoon, Margaret had reached the 18th room. She was moving purely on adrenaline, her arms trembling as she wiped down yet another marble sink. A voice behind her made her flinch. You missed a spot. She turned to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway. Her uniform was old but clean, and a gentle smile softened her lined face. Margaret frowned. Who are you? The woman stepped inside, setting down a small lunch bag. Eleanor. I've been working here for 27 years. Margaret stared. 27 years. She had never even noticed Eleanor before. Eleanor glanced around the room. You're doing better than I expected, she said, nodding at Margaret's work. Margaret stiffened. I'm not here to impress anyone. Eleanor chuckled. That's obvious. Margaret bristled, but said nothing. Eleanor sat down on the freshly made bed, stretching out her hands. Her fingers were gnarled from decades of hard labor, her nails trimmed short from years of scrubbing. You're Margaret Allen, aren't you? She asked casually. Margaret tensed. Even the older staff knew her name. Eleanor smiled knowingly. I remember you. You used to walk past us like we were furniture. Margaret's stomach twisted. But Eleanor continued, I also remember a young woman who once started from nothing. Margaret frowned. Eleanor leaned forward. I knew the old manager before you. She was just like you once. Sharp, ambitious, untouchable. But she had something you don't. Margaret swallowed. And what's that? Eleanor's gaze softened. Respect for the ones below her. The word struck Margaret like a punch to the gut. Eleanor patted her knee and stood. You'll either learn that, or you'll break. Then she walked out, leaving Margaret alone with the weight of her own failures. The breaking point. By the time Margaret finished her 20th room, it was past 8 o'clock. She was the last housekeeper still working. Her body screamed in protest as she pushed her cleaning cart toward the storage room. As she stepped inside, the sheer exhaustion finally hit her. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto a crate, shaking. For the first time in her life, Margaret Allen felt truly powerless. She couldn't do this. She was not built for this. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. A sudden noise snapped her out of her daze. She turned. Darren Cole stood in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable, his usual smugness absent. You're still here, he said after a moment. Margaret clenched her jaw. I don't quit. Darren studied her, then stepped forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A keycard. Margaret stared at it. What's that? Darren held it out. Your next assignment, he said. You're not done yet. Margaret's heart pounded. More. She snatched the keycard from his hand, glaring at him. What do you want from me? Darren's gaze darkened. I want you to understand, Margaret, he said quietly. You're not special. You never were. And if you want to survive, you earn it, just like everyone else. Then he turned and walked away. Margaret sat there, breathing hard, the keycard clenched in her trembling fist. She wasn't done yet. Not even close.